So, you have 40 PDFs. They are color-coded, they are in folders, they are beautifully named, and you are no closer to having a literature review. Because a stack, unfortunately, is not structure. I'm Nick. This is Dr. Cranky Pants Teaches, and today we're talking about organizing for synthesis. Not organizing your files, organizing your thinking. And there is a difference. Most people collect articles and then try to write their way into structure, which is kind of like dumping lumber on your yard and hoping a house appears. Synthesis is architecture, and architecture begins when you stop asking, what are these articles about? And start asking, how do they relate? So let's work this with an example. Let's stick with imagining our topic is instructional routines influencing vocabulary growth in multilingual elementary classrooms. At this point, you've screened, you've applied criteria, and you now have a working set. Now what? Your first layer is going to be drivers. And drivers are the pressures that make this body of literature exist. Why is this research happening? In our example, you might notice that many articles frame the work around achievement gaps, or equity for multilingual learners, or standards-based accountability, instructional improvement. Those right there are examples of drivers. If you removed equity from the conversation, would half the literature disappear? Probably. That tells you equity is not just a theme, it's structural. Drivers tell you what the field believes is at stake. Now, the second layer is mechanisms. This is where we get serious because mechanisms answer how is vocabulary growth supposedly happening? Not students improved, but what caused that improvement? As you scan your set, maybe you notice recurring mechanisms. Explicit modeling of word meaning, structured peer interactions, repeated exposure through read aloud, morphological analysis, and feedback cycles. Now, you are not summarizing. You are isolating causal agents. And here's where the synthesis begins. You might notice that different articles share a driver, equity, but rely on different mechanisms. That's a pattern. Now there's a third layer, context clusters. And this is where doctoral thinking sharpens. Under what conditions do these mechanisms operate? Urban classrooms, rural districts, dual language programs, pull-out ESL models, high-resource environments, under-resourced schools? Context answers, where does this hold? You may discover something interesting. Explicit modeling appears across contexts. But structured peer interactions only show strong outcomes in classrooms with stable grouping structures. And now we're thinking. Mechanisms do not float freely. They live in context. Our fourth layer is method clusters. And this is not about declaring allegiance to quantitative or qualitative research. Rather, this is about asking what kinds of claims do these methods permit? Maybe your modeling studies are randomized control trials, strong causal influence. Maybe your peer interaction studies are classroom ethnographies with rich description but weaker causal claims. Maybe your morphological analysis studies are quasi-experimental, different evidentiary weight. Now something important happens. You may notice that contradictions are not conceptual. They are methodological. One study claims large effects, another claims minimal impact. But one is correlational and the other is experimental. That matters. Method clusters help you interpret disagreement, which brings us to that fifth layer, contradiction mapping. And this is where most literature reviews collapse. Students say some scholars argue X while others argue Y, and then they move on. Let's not do that. We map contradiction. Is the disagreement about mechanism? Is it about context? Is it about population? Is it about measurement or is it about definition? In our example, maybe one study says peer interaction has strong effects. Another says minimal effects. When you map them, you realize the strong effect study involved structured roles and teacher modeling beforehand. The minimal effect study involved open discussion without scaffolding. The contradiction dissolves. It's conditional. Under these conditions X, under these conditions Y. That is synthesis. Now step back. What have we done? We did not sort by topic, but we layered the literature. Drivers, why the research exists. Mechanisms, how the phenomenon works. Context, where and for whom. And methods, how claims are justified, until we arrive at contradiction, where tensions live. And that's structure, that's architecture. And here's why this protects you. When you sit down to write, you are no longer staring at 40 unrelated PDFs. You are writing about the drivers shaping the field, the mechanisms researchers proposed, the context that condition those mechanisms, the methods that justify those claims, and the tensions that remain unresolved. That is a literature review, not a summary parade. Now, let me also say something slightly uncomfortable. If you cannot name mechanisms in your set, you do not yet understand the literature. If you cannot name context clusters, you cannot make portability claims. If you cannot explain contradictions, you are not synthesizing. And that's not criticism, that's developmental. This is the moment where you move from collecting to structuring, from stacking to shaping. And it does not require a new tool. It requires looking at what you already have differently. So take your working set and ask, what are the drivers? What mechanisms recur? Where do they operate? What methods dominate? And where do studies disagree? And why? You're building a map, and maps make writing possible. If this made your pile of PDFs feel less like chaos and more like a system you can navigate, that matters. I appreciate you. I'll see you in the next one.